Welcome to Science Week 2025 and to this evening's entertainment, which comes to you courtesy of the School of Psychological Sciences. I'm just going to say a few words before I hand over to the main speakers. So Science Week is an annual event. It aims to broaden the awareness of Birkbeck science teaching and research beyond the faculty, the academic members of the department. And we do this through a series of public lectures, so these lectures are open to all. Our aim is to appeal to a general audience, past students, future students, present students, people from the Faculty of Science, people outside the Faculty of Science at Birkbeck, and the general public. And I hope that we will do that tonight. I think we have an interesting session. During the week, though, we'll also hear from we'll hear from all three schools. Tonight we have Psychological Sciences, as I said. Tomorrow night we have Natural Sciences. On Wednesday night we have Computing and Mathematical Sciences. And then on Thursday night we'll have an inaugural professorial lecture from Sanjeev Bhatta of the School of Natural Sciences. That professorial lecture, inaugural professorial lecture, is actually the fourth one this session, this period. We've already had three. Professor Underwood, Professor Doublard, and Professor Ferret. Those three previous inaugural professorial lectures are all great, and I thoroughly recommend them to you. They already are or they will be on Birkbeck's YouTube channel. So you can go to Birkbeck's YouTube channel, search for Charlie Underwood, and you'll find his wonderful inaugural lecture on Megalodon and other large sharks. I think the last two from last week are not quite up there yet. We have to do the transcribing for them all. Okay, we also have more inaugural lectures coming throughout the summer, or certainly another one coming at the end of the summer. So I recommend that to you as well. Okay, before we continue though, I'd also like to thank various people involved in organizing this and ensuring this event works smoothly. Particular Charlotte Lowe from the science office, who's sort of made sure that all the adverts go out, that all the tech is working, and so on. I'd also like to thank Daniel Yon for organizing the speakers, and Sylvia Segetsi for organizing all of the posters. After our talks this evening, we will have some posters which show the work of the early career researchers in psychological sciences, and we'll have similar things for the other schools later in the week. Okay, so as I said, this week it's all about tonight is all about psychological sciences. So we will shortly be welcoming for a presentation and then discussion Dr. Daniel Yon and Sylvia Segetsi to interview him, grill him on his new popular science book, A Trick of the Mind, which I have here. You will all have a bookmark, which you can do with as you would. Before then, though, we have it is my a real pleasure to celebrate our prize winner for the our PhD student prize winner for psychological sciences for 2025, and this goes to Dr. Denise Cadet, who's just done her Viva in the last 6 weeks or so. So let me briefly read from the full citation of Denise's work that has been produced by the selection panel. Denise's work on the cognitive processes underlying our experience of our own bodies has already begun to have an important impact on the field. Along with a string of publications, other prizes, and invitations to speak at conferences and seminars, Denise is establishing herself as an important and independent voice in this area of research. Indeed, this growing independence is perhaps best exemplified by Denise's success in obtaining independent postdoctoral funding from the Wellcome Institutional Fund for Research Culture to continue her work and to cement the next steps in her career. Now, while the selection panel were impressed by these clear achievements from Denise as a scientist, they were also impressed by the contributions that Denise has made to the culture of the department, or school, and Birkbeck as a whole. Her nomination made clear, she did not put in her nomination, I should emphasize that, her nomination from her supervisors made clear that she is an effective mentor and a departmental citizen. And it is these contributions to life at Birkbeck that we also hope to recognize with this award. So without further ado, let me hand over to Denise, who will speak briefly about her work, or as long as she likes, about her work, before we then move on to other things.
Thank you, Rick. Good evening. Welcome to Science Week. I'm so happy to see you all here. Today, I'm going to talk to you about how our minds shape body perception. So what is it like to have a body? I'd like to think for a second, what is this feeling of having a body? So to do that, imagine you'd have to explain to an AI being with no body, what does it feel like to have a body? What it feels like to have a human body. So the nervous system is constantly receiving information from the body about the body. And it does a pretty good job at making us have this stable and constant sensation of our body. Another very important thing that our brain does is to identify what is the body and what is not. And if you think about it, just at this moment, while you're sitting here, it's very unlikely that you're questioning whether your hands are your hands, whether this body belongs to you or to the person sitting next to you. Usually, we don't have this kind of worries because our brain does a good job at keeping this in track. However, these errors can happen. We do have a map of the body and the brain. So this means we have a dedicated cortical representation, dedicated neurons to each part of our body, and some parts are more represented because we also use them more. So what happens when humans lose a limb? If we have a cortical representation for each part of our body, if we then lose a limb, if we lose a hand, what happens to those neurons that were dedicated to represent the hand for us to move and to sense? What does it happen? There is some debate on this, and throughout some years, there was a big excitement around how flexible the brain was, where neighboring areas would take over this area. But more recent research also shows that this map that we have in our brain of our body can be so specific and so persistent that even after 31 years after amputation, after losing a limb, the cortical representation of the hand was still there, intact. And a lot has been searched about what happens when we lose a limb. What happens when we instead gain a limb? Do you think in the future we'll be able to become cyborgs, to control supernumerary robotic limbs, and to feel that supernumerary limbs are part of our body? So now I'm going to ask you, if you think yes, hands up. If you're a bit more skeptic, you can do a waving. Interesting, very mixed. I like this. What if I told you that we can instantly feel like we have a sixth finger on our hands? So just by using a trick with mirrors and synchronous stroking, Newport created this illusion where he creates the feeling of having a finger on the hand. However, this only lasted a tiny second, so it was unclear whether this was a confusion. And in my master's degree here at Birkbeck in cognitive neuroscience, some years ago, before my PhD, I developed a way of making this illusion last longer. And if people feel a sixth finger for a long time, it means we can have an endured representation of a sixth finger. And this is very exciting for the field, but it's also exciting in terms of a paradigm that we can now use to study body perception. Because a big issue in the field is that I cannot remove a hand from you, put it back, and ask you, how does it feel like, measure your physiological data. This has been solved in the field for many years with some illusions that I call replacement illusions. It's illusions where you start feeling a hand that is part of your body, for instance, a rubber hand, and you can feel it's part of your body, and it's been very helpful for us to test some hypotheses about body perception. However, this is still about a body part that you always had. What we can do now with this paradigm is that we can test how it feels like to have limbs that we never had, and how our minds can build this perception, body perception from scratch. So with this paradigm, I was able to test also what it feels like to have an extra body part and how different that can be from perceiving the actual body that you have. And this extra finger can be felt with a different size, so longer or shorter than the actual finger. And this is very important because it shows that the extra finger is independent from the actual fingers in two ways. So not just where the fingers are in this moment, I have my fingers here that look like this, but also in terms of how even fingers look like. And I was able to induce the feeling of having a curved finger in the weird position where we never have our fingers and we could never anatomically possibly have our fingers. What about orientation? Just a bit of context in the field, we know that if we embody our hand as our hand, as the actual part of our body, we cannot feel in a different position because the muscles in your body keep telling your brain that the hand is in that position, so it cannot be. It's in this position. If your hand is in another position, that cannot be. This is not the same what happens for extra body parts. And this is probably because somehow our brain must be prepared to embody extra body parts. And if it's an extra body part, it's okay that it's in a different position. It doesn't need to be in the same one. Then we produce this in people with anorexia, who we now have a different type of body perception. And they feel this finger in different orientations consistently less rotated than control participants. This is interesting both in terms of understanding there's one type of a constraint in people with this disorder, but it also gives a hint about the constraint to embody a six finger, in which it's fine. Both people with anorexia and controls can embody at the same extent a six finger, but the position of that finger is felt in a different location, always closer to the body. And now you may tell me, okay, there's this illusion, there's a sensation that I have a six finger, but I don't think that our brain actually thinks. I don't think that we really feel that just by feeling a six finger in a mirror, we'll be able to use it. We'll feel like we have extra abilities, augmented abilities with this finger. So what we did is that after inducing because it's an invisible finger, I cannot actually make people grab cups with it. It's invisible, it doesn't exist. However, after the illusion, we asked participants to choose the widest aperture they could fit the hand through, and the biggest block they were able to grasp. After the illusion, they chose a wider aperture and a bigger block. And now what it's very interesting for me, because one of the reasons that I had to run this experiment was to have another measure for the six finger illusion that didn't rely only on the reported experience. Even when participants did not report feeling a six finger, they still chose a wider aperture. And bear in mind, this is not, they don't realize it's bigger. They're just giving out estimates of how large it's an actual physical object, and it's minimal. But consistently, they choose a bigger aperture, a bigger block. So it seems that it's updating our action perception, what we think we can do in the world with our hands, that throughout our entire life had only 5 fingers. It only had the 6th finger for 1 minute of that. So to sum up, in evolution, there's a 5-finger constraint. So that means throughout evolution, with animals that have 4 limbs don't have the ability to have 6 fingers, because the 5 is the limit. So they can have 3, 2, up to 5. And if I have biology enthusiasts in the room, you might say, but there's some animals that have a 6th finger. I think I've read about it, right? So the aya is one of these examples, but it's not a real finger. It's called a pseudothumb. So it's made out of, because it needed, in its evolution, it developed a way of having it, but it's not a real digit. And yet, there are still people who are born, and it happens, has a big occurrence of people who are born with 6 fingers. And there's this amazing family in Brazil that have a 6th finger, which is an extra thumb. So this is a brilliant opportunity to study if they indeed can cope with an extra finger, because our brain, bear in mind, throughout billions of years, millions of years, it developed along with a certain body that it had to control and to sense. And yet, people who are born with 6 fingers, they are better than us at playing the piano. They can tie one shoe with just one hand, which for us would be completely impossible, because now they have two abduction fingers, so they can do a range of actions. And in my case, what I'm really interested is that they have a cortical representation for that extra finger. They have extra muscles, extra tendons, a whole dedicated system to support these augmented abilities that this finger brings, because it's not just about representing that finger, but the coordination with the other fingers. This is very promising. However, they did have a lifetime of experience to adapt to this extra finger that they were born with. And still, instantly, in healthy individuals, we are able to induce the experience of having a 6th finger. And these extra body parts can have an endured representation in our brain, independent from our fingers, both in terms of where the fingers are now and the long-term representation of our fingers, of what fingers should look like. It is flexible in terms of size, shape, orientation. It's unconstrained by posture, and it can even update action perception. So I would like to thank my amazing supervisors. I'd like to thank my collaborators and all the people that made this journey completely the best years of my life.
It's now equally great pleasure to hand over to Daniel John, who is going to talk for a little while about his, as I say, his popular science book that is shortly to be released. And this is why when I say you need to actually keep these for a few days, because you can't buy this. You can pre-order, but you can't buy it.
If you have pre-ordered, you actually might already have it, because they're so efficient. Some people have it.
Okay.
There's-
Not out until the
That
26th.
that is a QR code that you can send with you and pre-order.
Right. So Daniel will talk about this for a short while, and then I think Sylvia will grill Daniel about the book. So hand over to Daniel.
Thank you very much, Rick. It's very nice to be here and to share the stage with Denise. It's particularly nice to be talking as part of Science Week, because I was once a Birkbeck student and now I'm a Birkbeck scientist. And so I wouldn't have been able to have written this book without the training that Birkbeck gave me. But there's also something I think even more kind of apposite about it being Science Week, which is that what I'm trying to argue for in this book is actually not just that the few people that work at Birkbeck are scientists, but in a way, all of us are. And that in particular, each of us inside of our skull has a scientist working away. So if you want to tune out now, basically the take-home message of the talk will be this, that your brain is, in fact, like a scientist. And what I mean by that is I think that your brain is in the business of building its own theories to understand how the world works. But just like scientists, we can get stuck with our theories, stuck with using them to make sense of the data the world gives us. And so the theories that we generate become the lens through which everything else is seen. I think you can even see this if you have a bookmark in front of you on the cover of the book itself. So that little apple on the page there, many of you will perceive it as a red apple on a blue background. But in fact, it's completely grey. The apple hasn't got a drop of red ink on it. It's easier to see, in fact, on the pink version. But when you look at it, it seems red because that's a theory that your brain has concocted. It's a theory you have about how the world works, and you see that theory reflected back at you rather than the true ink on the page. Now, this isn't just happening for apples, it's happening for everything. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is how coming to see your brain as a scientist can help you to understand how you create the world that you live in. But the world in reality is not really just one thing. And following from people like Karl Popper or Roger Penrose, we can actually think that really all of us live in 3 worlds at once. So Popper told us that we live, for instance, in the material world, the world of physical stuff and molecules and atoms and all the things that make up the things around you. But as well as that material world, we live inside a mental world. There's the world of other people's minds, their thoughts and feelings, intentions, desires, but also the mind inside our own head. And Popper's third and kind of final world that he was interested in was this world of ideas. So things like concepts or religions or philosophies or mathematics or even kind of science itself. These things seem just as real as the minds that think about them or the matter that makes those minds up. So what I'd like to talk to you about briefly today before Sylvia grills me is a sense of these three different worlds and how the scientist in your head lets you live inside all of them. And we'll start with that material world, and in particular the way that your brain has to measure the reality that surrounds it. And I suppose I'd like to get you to think that, our familiar kind of intuitive sense of our senses is that the organs we have, things like our eyes and ears, are a bit like measuring instruments. So your eyes might be akin to a camera, just taking pictures and measuring signals from the world. But what the kind of latest science seems to tell us is that there isn't really a close analogy there, and that in fact, if your eyes are like cameras, it's much more like a camera that edits its own pictures. There's a sense in which we aren't just in touch with the raw signals being picked up from the world, but our own theories are bleeding into our experience that we have. You can demonstrate this quite nicely, for instance, if you think of this picture. So some of you might have seen this before, but if you haven't, it just looks like a brick wall. And that's, just the light that's bouncing off of your eyes is giving you that picture of a brick wall, but that's not really just what's there. In fact, if I draw a little circle, you can see there's this cigar that's actually been put into the bricks. It's actually sticking straight out. And once that frame is removed, all of a sudden you can not unsee what you now know. The actual pixels on the screen, the light going into your eyes hasn't changed at all, but your interpretation has changed because you have different prior knowledge, you've got a different theory. Other people have shown this in slightly more kind of controlled ways in the lab, such as this nice demonstration developed by Christoph Teufel. So in these kind of binarized photos, Christoph takes real images and makes them go entirely black and white. Makes it very difficult to extract the signal behind the noise. Can anybody guess what's in this? Most people guess Dalmatian, because there's a very famous example of this that's a Dalmatian. It's not in fact that. I don't think you'll get it. But if I told you that it was in fact a reindeer eating a carrot through a car window, it's very difficult to extract that from the original image. But once you now know what the world contains, you know what should be there, I can show you back the original, and all of a sudden that kind of signal springs out through the noise. Indeed, in some of Christoph's experiments, he can show that people begin to perceive edges in the blank space, even though there's, objectively speaking, absolutely nothing there. This isn't just about vision. You can also have similar kinds of effects in what you hear, the other senses. So if I play you a sound like this one, some of you might get a hint of human voice in that, but for lots of people, it just sounds like a kind of crackly robotic whistle. But that is in fact a sort of degraded form of human speech. And if I do a similar thing to the kind of Teufel demo, I play you the real sentence, I can play you exactly the same file. And it becomes a bit more intelligible. It becomes possible to hear the voice that's in that completely degraded noisy signal. So what this seems to be showing us is that our kind of perception is this sort of synthesis of the data that's coming in, but also the theories we're using to make sense of it. And scientists have found some pretty clever ways of seeing how that's happening inside the brain. So one really nice demonstration came from a study that was developed by Fraser Smith and Lars Muckley. And what they did in this experiment was they put people inside an MRI scanner and showed them photos that look like this. So it's a completely normal, natural photograph, but one quadrant is completely removed. So if you think about your eyes, in that empty quadrant, absolutely nothing is being presented to the retina. It's just blank, empty space. But because of the way that your sort of visual brain is arranged, if we put you in an MRI scanner, we can map out the different locations on the screen, and we can map out, in particular, that bit in the quadrant where nothing's being presented to your eyes, that kind of empty zone. And if you do that, what people like Smith and Muckley find is that it might be an empty quadrant on the screen, but it's very much not empty for your brain. that you can find the neurons in that region of space contain information about what the rest of that picture is showing you, as if the brain is injecting its own kind of predictions into into that empty space about what ought to be there. It's as though for your brain there isn't really a kind of blank canvas, but a sort of area on which to project its own theories and beliefs. In some nice sort of follow-up experiments, it turned out you can sort of think about these patterns as being a bit like your brain sketching in a line drawing of what ought to be there. So sometimes if you're given these empty scenes, you can think that your brain can use the context, it can use what it knows, it can use its rich inner models of how the world works to inject some virtual input into what should be there. And often that will be quite close to the truth. It's a very effective way of making sense of the world around you. But just like in science, you might have very good theories, but those theories are not always going to be correct. So you can come to one of these ambiguous scenes and project something that seems really plausible, but it can completely miss what reality is really like. So in this particular person, for instance, they weren't able to predict that there's a bridge here in real life. The hypothesis they made was wrong. Once we start to think about perception in this way, though, we think of it as not just being about taking information in, but by bringing our own prior knowledge to bear on what we experience, I think we begin to think differently about some rather strange experiences that can occur. So in the book, I talk quite a bit, actually, maybe a bit of a digression for a cognitive neuroscientist, about a medieval mystic called Margery Kempe. So Margery began life with a pretty ordinary middle-class medieval life. She lived in what was then Bishop's Lynn, now King's Lynn in Norfolk. But after a particularly difficult childbirth, she began to be tortured by various visions. So she describes in great detail being visited by these demons and having them kind of torturing her with flames. At some points, the kind of threats become so severe, she basically tries to attempt suicide by trying to bite her own hand to try and bleed herself to death. But these visions, they change color quite dramatically over the course of a few months. Eventually, she's no longer tortured by these kind of apparitions, but instead she's visited by Christ himself in this kind of beautiful silk robe, appears to her, tells her she's in fact saved. She doesn't need to worry about the devils anymore. In Kempe's own time, those experiences inspired her to go on a sort of mystical spiritual journey. So she goes around England, she goes around Christendom, and her experiences of angels and of devils become something that give her the license to talk about the divine to the people that she meets. But when people in more modern times discovered Kempe's biography, and this is in the sort of 30s, 40s, the scholarship continues through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and to the present day, people have mostly thought that Margery was just mad, that she was simply just hallucinating. She wasn't a conduit for the divine, she was just hearing voices. Now, if you think about it, if you think about perception the way that I've been encouraging you to think about it, in actuality, we can think that what's happening in Kempe's case is not necessarily a sign of madness. It's a sign of the way that our brains synthesize the world we live in. So for Kempe, she was a devout Catholic living in the Middle Ages who thought that heaven and hell existed and that these forces were shaping the world in front of her. With those kind of theories buried in her mind, we can think that they were simply being reflected back at her. It's not for me to say whether those theories are right or wrong, but you can think that those theories are enough to give the experiences that they portend. Now, I can't go back in time to scan Margery's brain and see what was happening, but this idea has kind of taken hold in current thinking about psychiatry, in particular, the way that we might think that other kinds of unusual experiences like hallucinations might arise. So if what I'm telling you is true, you can think that you might be prone to misperceive the world around you if you rely too heavily on those theories that your brain's concocting for you. And this is precisely at the heart of some modern theories of how hallucinations might work in psychotic illnesses like schizophrenia. If you take people who experience hallucinations in the clinic and give them these kinds of experimental tasks, again, this is the one from Christoph Teufel, you can create this benefit of seeing the world through your theories in a kind of lab-based setting. So this is the same kind of illustration. This one's not a reindeer this time, it's actually a small child completing a puzzle. you get the same effect. It was very difficult to see that before, but it becomes clarified after. What you see if you run these kinds of experiments with people who hallucinate versus people who don't, is that the hallucinators, the people who experience, say, voices, unexplained voices kind of torturing them in their daily life, those people actually show a more extreme benefit of this kind of preview knowledge in this kind of perceptual task. Now, in some senses, this is a kind of holy grail for scientists studying psychiatric groups, because usually what you find is that the patients you study are worse at the task. You can think that that's in some ways not a particularly interesting finding, because if you're someone who's struggling a lot with a very debilitating mental illness, finding it harder to take part in one of these strange experiments someone like me gives you is not, particularly noteworthy. But in this case, these people who are having very distressing symptoms nonetheless are better at the task. They show a stronger benefit of this kind of knowledge when perceiving the world, as if they're relying more on their kind of theories to make sense of the world around them. A kind of interesting nuance you get, though, if you kind of delve into this literature, is that it's not just the case that people who are relying more on their theories to make sense of the world are mentally unwell. A really interesting kind of case comparison comes from people who hallucinate but don't have any kind of psychiatric illness. So a particularly interesting group is a group known as clairaudient psychics, people who believe they hear, well, not believe, they do hear voices. They hear voices which they believe come, from the netherworld, or the voices from the dead, trying to get in touch with the living with important messages to pass on. If you're one of these clairaudient psychics and you go and see a psychiatrist, hearing those voices alone will not get you a diagnosis of any mental illness. But nonetheless, if you run these kinds of experiments, you can see that hallucinators who are unwell and these kind of everyday hallucinators are also showing this similar kind of proneness to perceive the world through the lens of a theory. I think that, in some sense, should give us a slightly more humbling view on what's happening in some of these cases of psychotic illness and kind of mental illness more broadly, because it means that perceiving the world in a way that somewhat detaches from reality isn't actually a sign that you're sick. In particular, if we actually appreciate that theory-laden nature of perception, we can begin to make sense of some strange experiences like hallucinations or psychotic or psychics hearing voices. But it puts us all on a sort of continuum, that all of us are, in some sense, perceiving the world through this similar constructive way. It's not that some of us see it clearly and some of us see it in a wholly distorted way, but all of us are seeing the world through the filter of our own brain's theories. Which puts us, I think, in that middle mental world now, where I want to talk not so much about how we perceive that world around us, but how we might perceive other people and the minds that they have. And the idea that I kind of want to leave you with here is that other people are really like other planets. We often talk about kind of getting inside someone's head, reading their mind, being in someone else's shoes. But in reality, we can never truly know what it's like to be someone else and to feel things from their perspective. I think that when we try to understand the mental life of other people, we're doing something that's a bit like what scientists do when they search for life on other planets. When we send a satellite up and try and work out could there be life on Mars, we don't go and visit and try to live on Mars ourselves. What we do is we build a model of what life should look like. We model what life is like on planet Earth, and we look for those same signs in a distant place we could never really visit. I think that something similar is happening when we try to understand other people. We have a theory about what mental life should be like, and we understand other people by looking for the similar signs in them. So one nice way you can see this often is through very impoverished sorts of experiments on body language with things like this point light walker. So most people, when they view this, have the sense, even though there's very, very limited information shown here, that they can see somebody walking down the street. And you also get some kind of access into their mind. You can get the sense this person, they seem pretty jolly, quite confident, they've got somewhere important to be. But all of these kind of perceptions of those kind of internal affective states, they hinge on being able to read those signals in a way that makes sense. If I say, oh, that person is moving quite quickly, they seem quite in a good mood, there seems to be a sense in which I have to work out how fast or how slow does happy look. If they were kind of moving along glumly, I could think that they felt sad, but how slow would they have to be before they looked depressed? And one insight that you get from some of the kind of latest work on things like social perception is that there doesn't really just seem to be a single body language that we all speak, but rather each of us has a kind of body dialect. We're all sort of tuned to the way that we move, and we use that theory, that model, to make sense of other people. That can be really important if we start to think that other people might not move and emote the way that we do, and so we might misunderstand each other if those theories misalign. One kind of really nice example of this that was based on some work that I was involved in here at Birkbeck is that as we grow up, maybe you didn't need me to tell you this, as we grow up, as we get older, our bodies slow down. In particular, as you move from sort of childhood through to adolescence through to adulthood, there's a kind of marked change in how fast you move, such that you're faster when you're a younger adolescent and you're slower when you're more adult-sized. Now, that is a kind of not particularly psychological fact. It's just a fact about how your body changes as you grow. But it does lead to important differences in what emotions look like in different age groups. So if just at baseline, you're much slower when you're an adult, through the eyes of a young adolescent, you seem unusually slow, unusually glum, unusually sad. Likewise, though, if you are just a completely typical adolescent, you'll move quite a bit faster than the adults around you, even when you feel nothing at all. And that particularly fast movement can give the appearance of exuberant joy or unexplainable anger. And you can think that through the theories that you have built up of how your body moves, you could end up seeing each other through the wrong lens. In particular, you can think that if two perfectly neutral adults and adolescents were put next to each other, you might have a situation where the perfectly normal movements of the teenagers seem unusually aggressive and quick, while the movements of the parents seem unusually slow and upset. And this leads you to search for explanations for what's happening in these interactions when really nobody feels nothing at all. But this idea of miscalibration and miscommunication, I think, isn't just relevant to teenagers trying to understand their parents or vice versa. It can also have important implications for how we might need to rethink different aspects of neurodiversity too. So one kind of nice example of this, I think, comes from work on autism. So classic work on kind of autism and autism spectrum conditions classed or kind of considered autism as being a fundamental problem with how people understand the perspectives of other people. And one kind of illustration of this came from these sorts of displays developed by Hyder and Simmel, where you could take kind of completely arbitrary geometric shapes and have them engage in what the kind of majority at large sees as an interaction. So people would report, typically in Hyder and Simmel's original work, that that triangle is bullying the other one, and that maybe the little one is really the hero, and that the big one is the villain. And what struck people when they were presenting these kinds of vignettes to different kind of autistic groups was that people with autism were just less likely to spontaneously describe these interactions with mentalistic terms. So rather than describing it as sort of bullying or attacking or kind of trapping, things that only agents can do to other agents, you would get descriptions that said things like, triangles and circles are moving on the screen, which is, of course, completely accurate. This difference in behavior, though, led people to think that the fundamental difference in autism is just an inability to access, to represent the minds of other people. But I think that that can be a rather sort of chauvinistic view once you start to think everybody is actually understanding everybody else through a particular theory that's tuned to the particular way that they make sense of their own movements. These displays, when they were originally used in research, were not developed with autistic people in mind. They were just developed by graphic designers who moved things the way that they thought they should move. In some, I think, really kind of nice work that was done by my old boss, Claire Press, Claire found that if you look at the way that autistic people move, even in really simple movements like moving your arm from side to side, you can see important differences in those kind of basic kinematics. So in the kind of groups with autism in this study, the movements from side to side were a bit faster, a bit more accelerated, a little bit more jerky. Now that's just, again, a sort of not particularly kind of rich feature of how these different groups behave. It's kind of, you might not even notice it, I think, if you were to watch these kind of videos. But these kind of subtle differences in how movements occur can lead us to think that perhaps there'll be differences in how internal states get expressed through these observable signs that we will use to make sense of each other. So in particular, some nice work that was led by Rosie Eady, also here at Birkbeck, tried to kind of reset the balance between these kind of, I guess in some ways, initially quite unfair experiments, which sort of stack the odds against people who might move differently. So what she did was she had people come to the lab here in Birkbeck, and rather than show them all the same cartoons, she would actually get them to produce their own expressive movements through these triangles. I think actually to make this possible, Harish Patel had to remove a ceiling panel, which he wasn't allowed to do, but thank you, Harish. So what she would do is she'd bring people into the lab and they'd be given a very kind of chaotic instruction like, make it look like the red triangle is seducing the blue triangle. And people would sort of do their best to kind of act this out. But she had a camera in the ceiling, which was filming the interaction. And with a bit of light editing, she could then turn those movements into cartoons that were like the original Hyder and Simmel work. The key thing that kind of marked this study out there was that some of these illustrations were developed by people who were neurotypical, but some of them were developed by people who had autism. So you had kind of what movements that look like the neurotypical majority, and also movements that look like the way that particular autistic people move. And what you find in these kinds of experiments, when you reset the balance and you start to account for the way that different people are seeing the world through different filters, is that it's not just the case that there's some global problem in the kind of autistic group, and the neurotypical are always good at reading other people's states of mind. In fact, there's something that other researchers have called the double empathy problem. So in actual fact, we can find that people with autism can find it difficult to access the kind of expressions and actions of the neurotypical majority, but it also cuts both ways. In Rosie's experiments, neurotypicals can struggle to read the intent of those autistic actions too. And we can think this can come about not because one group is good at understanding or one group is bad at understanding, but because it always essentially takes two to tango. And that if we are coming to understand each other through mistuned theories, we're going to misunderstand how the other person thinks and feels. So it's not just about understanding that external physical world. I think that we also understand other people through a theory that's tuned to our own experiences of ourselves and our own internal life. And that will mean that we'll be prone to misunderstand other minds that don't fit those theories and those assumptions. In the final bit, though, I want to kind of zoom out even further beyond the things that most of us can ever see into that world of ideas. And in particular, I want to think about what happens in the mind and in the brain when we have to undergo a paradigm shift. So far, I've been telling you that the game that your brain is in is that it's trying to understand the world, other people, and itself through theories and hypotheses that it kind of constructs based on past experiences. But if your brain is akin to a scientist, it's not all about building one paradigm and sticking with it no matter what. You also have to think, how does your brain know when its theory should change? How does it know when the paradigms it's built out should begin to shift? And when psychologists and neuroscientists study this, we tend to understand it through this kind of moniker of what's called meta-learning. So the idea of learning how to learn. And that can sound a little bit vague, but the basic principle is just that you learn from the world around you how much you should be flexible, how much you should stick with what you know, or how much you should update based on how things seem to be changing. If the world is a really unstable and changeable place, it will often be that your past experiences are no longer a good predictor of what the future will be like. So you'll want to undergo rapid changes in the beliefs that you hold. If the world is a pretty stable place, you'll want to stick with what you know because what you learned in the past will serve you well in the future. Now, meta-learning, to begin with at least, I think was studied in a rather kind of particularly technical way by lots of psychologists, and it was often quite difficult to map this onto what our real experiences are like. But that changed quite a lot during the COVID-19 pandemic. So through a kind of strange, sort of dark good fortune, there were researchers at Yale who were studying different aspects of this kind of flexibility to our belief updating in some really arbitrary psychological tasks. So the task that they were using, for instance, would be a kind of a card game on a computer where what you'd have to do is you would have these 3 decks, and behind one of the decks is hidden a sum of money. You have to work out which deck tends to have the good rewards to earn the most money in the task. The kind of kicker in this is that the good deck can move around. So you might have a long stretch where the money is always hidden under the red one, but then it will shift to being under the blue one. And what the researchers are looking at is how quickly do you change your mind? It's a kind of testing theories and hypotheses in miniature type task. Now, the researchers actually started this study well before the kind of Wuhan virus was taken seriously. They were doing their experiments in kind of late 2019, early 2020. Is that right? And what they were initially interested in was just how people playing these card games would behave differently depending on how paranoid they felt. They thought that people who had higher levels of paranoia would treat the decks with more kind of distrust. But in a way that was sort of catastrophic for the world, but was kind of quite good for them, the researchers were running this study while lockdowns were taking place across the US. So what the researchers could do is they could see what was the effect of undergoing a government-mandated lockdown, state by state, on this very simple psychological task. And when you do that, what you see is that people behave in this card game as if the card game has become unstable when governments start to impose restrictions. And they find that's particularly strong in the states that have the most ambiguous, unclear messaging. So if the world around you seems to be changing, and it's also changing in ways that seem in themselves unpredictable and volatile, that seems to seep into, in a very global sense, the way that you update your beliefs and change your mind. You start to behave as if, while you can't trust the world around you at all, you can't even trust these cards in front of you. People start to think that they're switching around much more than they really are. Now, this kind of change in the card games you think might not be that interesting if it was just happening in the task, but it turns out you can take what's happening in the lab, or in the lab-based task, it's actually all done online, I guess, during lockdown. And you can see that the people who are finding the decks of cards to become unpredictable and volatile also start to have these global changes in what they believe. So, for instance, the people who start to find that they're rapidly updating their theories and hypotheses about the decks are also more likely to endorse kind of conspiracies about COVID, thinking that, you know, the vaccines are front for sterilization, or that the vaccines have got microchips in them that will control your brain. It's as if you've become able to think things that you might not otherwise have thought before. And I think the kind of strongest illustration of that in this data comes from the fact that you see this pattern even for beliefs that have nothing to do with the pandemic. So people also, for instance, who have found those decks of cards, they experienced them as if they were switching around more than they really were also more likely to endorse kind of bizarre political conspiracies like the QAnon movement, the idea that there's a sort of secretive cabal running the United States that Donald Trump is kind of messianically fighting against. So it looks like if you live in a world that's unstable, that's going through a kind of period of uncertainty, that can change the way that you experience the environment, and it can change how firmly you hold on to things you used to think. It becomes possible to discard things that you used to think, but also to rapidly come up with something new. Often that will be adaptive in a changing world, but it also leaves you vulnerable. And in many ways, a kind of open mind ends up being a dangerous thing. The kind of pandemic was a particularly kind of extreme example that all of us experienced at once. But you can also take this idea further and think about not just the kind of global shocks we all experience, but the very particular private earthquakes that kind of reverberate through our lives. So I think there's quite a sort of touching description by the philosopher Samir Chopra, who talks about what it was like when his parents died. And he says, when my parents died, a fundamental metaphysical sundering between the world and me took place. Lightning had struck twice. The gravity the world had promised, the anchoring had disappeared. The world was now treacherous, lurking with pitfalls, crevices, and trapdoors. This sense that in the experience of something kind of unfathomably unexpected, these kind of model-breaking, theory-shaking events, you end up not just changing your mind about this particular part of the world you live in, but you end up with this global sense that the world's more unreliable than you thought. and the sounds around you might shift unexpectedly. If in similar kinds of experiments to these kind of card game ones, you can find that people who tend to experience more anxiety in their everyday life also tend to behave as if these quite arbitrary psychological experimental tasks are also more unpredictable and more shifting. This is not a particularly intuitive graph now I think about it, but what this is supposed to illustrate is that if you are experiencing more anxiety in your everyday life, it becomes harder for you to tell the difference between periods of true stable safety and periods of genuine volatility. It's as though even when you're experiencing an objectively stable world, things around you seem to be in flux and at flow. All of this, I think, lends a new way of thinking about some really enduring puzzles. So if you've seen the science fiction classic, The Matrix, you'll know that there's a scene where the main character Neo is presented with this sort of dilemma. So he's had all these sort of strange experiences, which has kind of led him to think that the world around him might not be as it seems, and all of his kind of familiar touchstones have sort of disappeared. And the character Morpheus offers Neo, the protagonist, an option. He says, you can either take this kind of blue pill and you can stick with your comfortable, familiar illusions, the way you used to think the world worked, and you'll never know the truth, or you can take this red pill and I think see how far the rabbit hole goes. Now in the film, of course, he takes the red pill because it moves the plot forward. It would be a very short film if he just says, no thanks. But I think kind of more than that, I think we're sort of supposed to think that we should take the red pill. That there's lots of kind of philosophies, ideologies, religions that would often kind of emphasize the idea that actually, in a way, the kind of human mind is a kind of cage, and what you want is to be taken away from it. You want to see the world as it really is, without all those superstitions and illusions. I think one person that puts this quite nicely is William Blake in this kind of reasonably famous quote about the doors of perception, where he says, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrowed chinks of his cavern. And people, particularly sort of, psychonauts, take this as a kind of mantra that you should be trying to see the world clearly. But I think that Blake kind of diagnoses exactly the problem in this quote. What would happen if you took away those paradigms you've built up is the world would be infinite. There's just far too much. You're kind of swimming in this sea of information, the data that's assaulting your senses. It's impossible for you to process the world as it is without a filter. It's not that you can perceive the world clearly or you can see it kind of dimly through a glass. It's that you can only see it at all because of the filters that you've built up, or because of these theories that the brain has made for you. In the same way that scientists can't really understand raw data just by looking at it, they need a theory to make sense of it. So do you. So I think in the end, we see the world, each other and ourselves through these paradigms that our brains made for us. And that does mean that we're prone to misperceive and to misunderstand. But I don't think that means we should want to throw those theories and paradigms away, take the red pill. I think we can only really think and perceive at all because of those paradigms, because of the theories that are generated by that scientist sitting inside your skull. And that, I think, can leave you with a maybe slightly more comforting thought, which is that just as science isn't just a process of finding out the answer and sticking with what you know, it's this constant progress of building paradigms, but also being alert to when they need adjusting. I can think that maybe just like science, your mind is also a work in progress. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you once again, Daniel and Sylvia, and all of, Denise, all of the other people who've spoken. We now have a poster session and drinks reception upstairs in room G16, which is all ready and waiting for us. So I hope to see you all up there, and I hope to see you also tomorrow for the natural sciences session of Science Week. Thank you.